Welcome. Thank you all. I'm Dan Porterfield, the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute. Only the best panel of the entire festival could possibly have drawn this many people inside when there is nirvana outside. Beautiful day. We hope you're having a great festival. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Jane Wales, who leads the Aspen Institute's Philanthropy and Social Innovation program, and who is a giant in the field of philanthropy. She has assembled a spectacular panel of leaders and thinkers in this space. And so, Jane, thank you so much for organizing.
Dan.
Thank you for being here. Take it away.
Thank you, Dan. And that's not only because he says nice things about me. He's a wonderful leader. I'm looking at this audience and really pleased to see many familiar faces and folks that could just as easily be on this panel. So hope you ask questions. So we have Sam Gill of the Doris Duke Foundation, Darren Walker, the Ford Foundation, and Brian Hooks, Stand Together, and the Charles Koch Foundation. These folks don't always agree. They don't, when it comes to policy positions, the grantees that they support take opposing views. However, what they do agree on, we heard about it in a recent op-ed they wrote, they argue vociferously for the right and maybe even the responsibility of one another to seed ideas, contribute to the marketplace of ideas, test those ideas with large audiences, build leaders who advance those ideas. I could go on. They defend one another's responsibility, I should say, right and responsibility to do so. So what I'm going to do, they've written an article, and I'll refer back to it several times. What I'm going to do is first ask each of them, why'd you write this article? What was the problem you were seeking to solve? And who was the audience you were looking to reach? So I'll start with Sam.
Sure, thanks. Well, thank you very much, Jane. Thanks to Aspen for hosting this conversation, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really looking forward to this. I think the institutional organized philanthropy is a very unusual thing, historically and also internationally. The idea that you can have immense amounts of privately aggregated wealth guided by private intent, broadly directed toward the public interest. And we allow it to exist because we believe, and it is shown historically, that it can be a very powerful force for social innovation. New ideas, new approaches, new ways of thinking and doing things can come out of philanthropy. Even when there's consensus at the highest levels about what to do, how to do it is often in question. And philanthropy has been important in enabling new ways of tackling problems. And historically, for obvious reasons, populist moments tend to be dangerous moments for philanthropy. People ask questions about why this form of capital should be allowed, and this moment is no exception. There are people on the left and right who have really specific ideas about whether philanthropy should exist, or whether it should exist in the form that it does, or whether it should be proscribed in some way around what it does. And so, for my part, I thought it was a really important moment to make the case for the role of philanthropy as a really important source of capital for innovation, for new ideas, and ultimately for social progress, to people who might be listening to these arguments and wondering, well, what is a foundation and why is it allowed to exist in this way?
And Darren, I'm going to ask the same question, but in the article you all argue that philanthropy is woven into the fabric of our democracy. So I'd love to have you say a word about why that phrase.
Thank you, Jane. It's always great to be with you, and such an honor to see so many people I admire in this room. I would say we in this country have benefited from philanthropy. It has contributed to strengthening our democracy. The very specific reason for me was to demonstrate that it is possible in the marketplace of ideas and the marketplace of philanthropy to agree on something with those you might otherwise not agree, and that the simple statement of consensus was worth lifting up, because regrettably it is so rare. And what has happened in our broader body politic in this country has also happened in philanthropy. And so the very specifics of a United States senator going on Fox News and saying that the Ford Foundation should be dissolved because we are perpetrating harm on the American people, really, for me, was a seminal moment in understanding the depth of how challenging this is going to be, and what a slippery slope we get on when we start to espouse that certain philanthropies should exist if they support these kinds of issues, and other philanthropies who don't support those issues or take a different position should not exist. I believed it was important for a diverse set of philanthropic organizations to come together to say, we believe in the idea of philanthropic pluralism, that in a diverse democracy, pluralism should be celebrated. And while we have different views on particular issues, those ideas should be discussed and debated in the marketplace, in the public square. They should not be prevented from being supported by philanthropy because they may be an anathema to any one particular part of society.
And you've partially answered the question of who you're trying to reach, because, I mean, there was both the question of why is this needed, but also who you're trying to reach if policymakers are actually taking that view. I would suspect that as we get closer and closer to an election year, we'll hear more of that, not less. So we're not all poli-sci majors, Brian, and we don't all come from academic institutions as you do. Tell us what pluralism means. Use the word pluralism and tell us what it means and how it, as it applies to our own democracy.
Happy to, although I would probably defer to Sam or to Darren on the particulars here. First off, I want to also thank you, Jane and Aspen. It's wonderful to be back with you, and it's really an honor to be up here with these two guys. You know, we didn't start off planning to write a piece. It's not like the three of us just called each other up and said, let's write something together. Yeah. We got together, or I got together with these two and with Heather and the others that signed on, because I have tremendous respect for the work that they do, and just being up here and hearing the two of them sort of make the case for why this is important sort of reinforces that for me. So I thought that was great. I agree with everything that you both said, and then that's not something that I always say. So pluralism, you know, it's one of those terms that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and so I think it is really important that we get specific in terms of how we think about it. And so I'll share how I think about it. These two may have some qualifications of their own to add, but at the most basic level, I think of pluralism as a set of principles and practices that enable diverse people to live well together. And that's it. And you might say, well, so what, right? What's the point of that, or why is that such a profound idea? And in a sense, because the fact that we have to ask that question is pretty amazing, because we do tend to take that idea for granted, that diverse people can live well together. But we have to remember that for millennia, right, for most of human history, that wasn't the case. For most of human history, the way that societies dealt with those who were different from them or who they disagreed with was to conquer them or to be conquered by them. And so the idea that we can recognize a core set of principles like dignity, right, the notion that every person, no matter who they are, where they come from, what they look like, what their parents did, no matter what, every person has inherent dignity, and that dignity requires respect. When we organize societies around principles like that, we get a pluralistic society. I think it's important also to sort of note what it's not, and this gets into some of the critique, which is very much welcome. It is not saying that we all have to agree. It is not saying that we should leave our strongly held convictions at the door. It's not saying that there's some sort of moral relativism, that we ought to give injustice a pass. It's not saying that we should be any less of an advocate for the ideas that we care about. It is saying that we ought to respect other people's rights and abilities to do all of those things as well.
And I think, you know, as we look back and how it sort of is part of kind of everyday parlance, we tend to think of demographic pluralism. That is to say, people from different traditions, different cultures, different histories can practice their own traditions freely alongside, you know, one another, but with an understanding that we have a shared society and a shared democracy. Ideological pluralism is much more what this is about, isn't it? And I will actually relate a conversation I had with Daniel Steed, who many of you probably all three know. He was a program officer at the Hewlett Foundation. And I got on the phone with him and said, I hear you're the big expert in pluralism, want to talk to you. This was like 3 years ago. And he said, liberals don't believe in pluralism. Liberals believe in demographic pluralism. But they believe you should disinvite a speaker you don't agree with. You should turn your back to that speaker. Liberals don't. And it was just a really interesting thing to say, you know, this is what pluralism is to me, and you guys don't mean it. And it was powerful coming from him. Who is saying to you all, based on this article, either you guys don't mean it, or I'm worried by what you're saying? Sam?
I'd probably taken the least heat of anyone on this stage. I should, you know, I mean, look. I think let me point to someone to a group of people who have a variety of thoughts about this piece, who I know that I admire, which is, you know, my own staff. You know, I think a lot of people who join a foundation do so because the ability to express and realize their individual moral commitments in the workplace is especially important to them. It's not the kind of group of people who say, well, one thing is my work life and another thing is my moral life. They want the two things to go together. And I think, you know, the kinds of questions that some people on my team, who I, you know, admire and respect, have raised and that we can get into are, you know, aren't there some views that ought to be disqualified? Aren't there some views that are beyond the pale? A version of that argument is, doesn't it lend legitimacy to some views to say that they have there's a basis for arguing for them in public reason? Another version of that argument is, sometimes some of the issues we're polarized over are truly existential. You know, there is arguably a question on the table now about whether democracy in this form ought to survive, and how to enable it to survive. So those are some of the views, you know, that, I mean, I think those views have been out there from others, but when I've heard it personally and in ways that I think are thoughtfully presented and I can respond to, those are some of the questions that come up.
So when we talked in advance about this, and I asked you what were the nature of some of the criticisms and what did you think of them, your response was, I was more moved by the questions that didn't get asked that I really wish that had been lobbed at us, because it would have been hard work to respond. You know, that they weren't sort of predictable complaints. But, you know, criticisms that are valid to some extent. Were there questions you wished you'd been asked, or criticisms you wished had been lobbed at you?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, to one of the things that the piece touches on, I think makes the point that not all agendas are morally equivalent. I think another thing the piece tries to touch on is that a lot of conflicts that we now experience as identitarian have really high stakes associated with them. So I think to Brian's point, you know, the life and death conflict that impelled the democratic experiment that we're the inheritors of strikes us as quaint today. You know, it's a conflict between sort of two different sects within Christianity, two or three different sects within Christianity. I can understand someone saying, look, if you're a Black American, this is a question of life and death. I can also understand someone making an extension of that argument, which is that the argument for civility, which is not really what this piece argues for, but it toys with it a little bit, can itself be a tool of engendering complicity, can itself be a tool of sanitizing oppression in the worst form. And that is an important discussion to have. There's a reason, in my view, as one of the authors, that we acknowledge the stakes of these identitarian debates in the piece, because they are life and death for so many people, that it is asking a lot of people to make the requests that this piece makes. It's not meant to be a light ask or a platitude.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, the reality is, just to extend on this point, because understandably I've received a lot of criticism. For so many people, these are not intellectual discussions. Racism in this country is real. Gender violence and the strand of anti-women theology that is manifest in our body politic is real. Homophobia is real. As a black gay man, I can attest to that. And so the people who see, and I have received a significant number of messages of disappointment in me for agreeing to sign on to this because of the fear of giving legitimacy to some spheres of philanthropy who are doing harm from where I sit. I have conversations with colleagues who are stark libertarians. I think libertarianism as an idea that evolved from Europe is fascinating. And if this were 19th century Austria, it might be an appropriate theology politically in this country. But to take an idea, to take Ayn Rand's books, which were written in the context of Eastern Europe and Russia, and hoist them onto America, to a context that is completely different, that is highly racialized, that is highly a caste system, and say what America needs is just good libertarianism. The idea that people should just be seen as people. And if we just are able to do that, the best people and the best ideas will rise to the top. I think, again, in 19th century Austria, that's a great idea. But in a country where certain people have had voice and their ideas been advantaged to the disadvantage of others, and simply say, we want a foundation that's going to support libertarianism, I personally disagree with that, but that foundation has a right to exist in this country and should be able to have a robust grant-making program, and just as the Ford Foundation and others, engage in the marketplace and hopefully have ideas of inclusion, an understanding of why we cannot reach equality in this country without some sense of racial consciousness. That hopefully the public will see that ideas that are steeped in these notions are more compelling than ideas that say we actually don't need racial consciousness. We just need people to be people, and everything will be great in America.
So I have good news and bad news, because I see friends from Silicon Valley out here, so they'll know who we're talking about. But there's a major foundation was created in the last 20 years by an individual tech entrepreneur who, I don't want to say too much, but who says he's motivated by Ayn Rand, right?
There are, just to be clear, and I don't want to cut you off, but let me underscore this. He is one of many, 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 and I spoke at a hedge fund. I mean, I practically was, run out of the room at a hedge fund CEOs gathering, because they see Ayn Rand, they all see themselves as, the protagonist what was his name? Rourke. Yes, they all see themselves as Rourke, and you just think, yeah, wow, okay, good for you.
So here's the good news. When you talk to him about Ayn Rand's writings, he totally misunderstood them. So it actually comes out very well. The foundation is great. However, Charles Koch, who speaks of himself as a classic liberal, and you may have to define liberalism as well for us, he's often referred to as a libertarian. Did you feel like that Darren was talking about him?
No, I'm still waiting for Darren to say something that I disagree with. In all seriousness, I think this is exactly the point. To me, at least, this is exactly the point of this op-ed, is that no dogma, no set of ideas that was written yesterday, let alone 100 years ago, is going to be correct and able to deal with whatever the challenges are that we've learned a whole lot more about today. Look, Ayn Rand wrote novels, right? If somebody wants to organize their philanthropy around a novelist, whether it's Ayn Rand or whoever your favorite fiction writer is, fine. Let's see how well that works in terms of their solving problems in the country. I think the precept that I start with, and I think that this is, to me, at the core of what I would define, how I would define liberalism in the classical sense, is that the only thing that we know for sure is that we don't know, right? However well we're doing right now, we know that we can always do better. And so the question that I ask, and I think that the reason that I was motivated to join this effort, is that I think that that sort of intellectual humility, that openness, which is at the core of what I understand to be liberalism, an openness, a recognition that progress comes when we're open to new ideas and new people, and that when we treat the way that we see the world as sort of the best that we can do now, but we don't go out for ways to prove our ideas right, we go out to look for ways to disprove that our ideas are right, and so that we find new and better ways to solve problems. If we don't allow that process of generating knowledge, figuring out what progress looks like to occur, if instead we anoint, whether it's the Ayn Rand advocate or the Karl Marx advocate or choose your favorite novelist advocate, to be the person that gets to decide which ideas count and which ideas don't, some people may benefit in the short term more than others, but our society is in real trouble. And so I think that we're going to have a lot of disagreement about which principles, which ideas are going to be most effective at solving some of the very real problems, Darren, that you just mentioned. But I think what we can't do is start with the presumption that because somebody comes with a certain approach to solving those problems, that they don't care about it, or that they don't acknowledge that it's a real problem. You might learn that along the way, right? But don't come with that presumption. Come with an openness to having your ideas challenged with an idea, not that you're going to change your mind, but you might learn something that could improve your approach.
And I think the challenge, though, that you've rightly identified, Brian, is we have a misattribution problem in our society. That is to say that if you disagree with me, black man, you are a racist. Yeah. I will attribute to you you and I debating this issue and our disagreement because you're a racist.
Right.
If I ask a question about Israel, the answer should not be I'm an anti-Semite because I'm asking, I want to have an inquiry. It should not be because I'm a queer man that you ask a question about blockers and children who are thinking about gender transition at age 14, that I'm, of course, or the person, of course, is a TERF or an anti-trans homophobe. If we cannot have inquiry without attributing ill will to the person asking the question or the person making a comment that may be ill-informed, it is hard to have a public square.
Right.
Because the public square, then the people who are asking questions leave the public square because the risk of engaging in the public square is too high. And so we leave the public square to the toxifiers, because the toxifiers want to own the square.
That's right.
Because if they can own the square and push us out, then they decide our future. And I think that's happening in our society, and some of us, even in our own grant making, are contributing to that. And I think we all, including my own institution, has to interrogate who we're funding and how they engage. Because if they're actually contributing to the problem, our ultimate objective of strengthening democracy and democratic institutions is not going to be achieved.
If I could just extend this line that's continued here too, I think to some extent focusing this discussion on the highest altitude of philosophical ideas actually oversimplifies precisely this challenge, right? Which is, it may seem that this op-ed is all about, two philosophical systems at war, two or more fundamental philosophical systems at war. But to return to something you said earlier, racism is real. Its costs and its harms are real. Take an example of how that manifests, right? I think it is now sort of well worn that the organization of law enforcement in this country is one of the instruments of oppression. Whatever you think about the intent of individual officers, whatever, that law enforcement is a part of the problem. The debate there about what to do among progressives is an internecine debate. It's not a debate about two fundamental philosophical systems coming into conflict. It's a debate among people who have broad consensus that something ought to be done to reorganize law enforcement to reduce racism and its harm in this country. And there's a lot of debate about the right way to do that, or the effective way to do that. If the public square debating that issue, to your point, Darren, becomes owned by what you call the toxifiers, so that the first question is just, do I believe you've aligned with me in some appropriate way, as opposed to what we're supposed to do, then we run the real risk of not actually materially reducing racism by figuring out the best way to reorganize law enforcement, or the best set of practices for law enforcement, or whether law enforcement, as we conceive of it today, should exist. These are all internecine debates among putative allies, and we've got to find the answers, because we have to improve the role that a public safety function plays in our society, such that it is not a contributor to racism, to racial harm, to racial terror, but is actually a contributor to some idea of public safety for all on everyone's own terms.
And I think this is a really important point that you make, Sam. So this is not just about sort of polite conversation amongst philanthropy, right? This is about how do you really solve big problems in the country. I'm hard-pressed to find an example of a major problem where the solution addressed it in a meaningful way and was sustainable, that didn't require people from diverse perspectives coming together, not giving up their differences by any stretch, but focusing on those areas where their ideas align and getting things done.
So I think a lot of this conversation sort of starts with a place of morality, and that's why one is able to demonize each other. But there's also efficacy. Right? And think about the times when you have come together, or where various points of view have come together. Criminal justice reform, right? Marriage equality. They weren't easy, but they were they were much easier than one would have expected, because folks across the political divide were in the same place. And of course, David Koch, who used to live down the way, was a big supporter of marriage equality.
Sure, of course. And let me just pick up on this thread of criminal justice reform, if I could, because the Ford Foundation, Stand Together, many organizations have been working in different areas of this for decades. And we still have a long way to go. But to the extent that we've been able to make progress, I think that the ability for people of very different perspectives to come together and find common cause to make progress has been a big part of that. But here's the thing. In the last couple of years, the political winds have turned against criminal justice reform. Politicians have decided to resort to the politics of fear to try to win elections, and they make claims about criminal justice reform that are not true, but scare people. And so you would expect that the support for these reforms would disappear, or we might even be facing a backlash, and we always need to be concerned about that. These are struggles that are never finished. But public opinion right now in favor of criminal justice reform, last time I checked, is over 70%, right? And I think that also has something to do with the way that it's been sort of moved forward. Now, again, it's not perfect. There's a lot of divergence in that data, right? Things that we need to do better on. But there's a way to have sustainable change, I think, when we approach challenges from this lens of sort of respect and pluralism. And again, it doesn't mean that we're all going to sort of sing kumbaya, far from it. But it does mean that we're at least open to solutions that wouldn't otherwise be on the table or even discovered if we didn't start from this presumption.
Yeah,
And that we didn't understand that we operate from very different theories of change. So the Ford Foundation's work, and with many of your members and you and others, this is where my libertarian friends, this is how I met my libertarian friends, because they have a view about the state and incarcerating individuals, the waste of public resources to do that. I really never heard. I mean, our view of this is an extension of an effort since the beginning of this country to control the lives of black people. And the narrative of that is clear, and the data and facts are clear. That's a very different, we don't approach this from the standpoint of an ideology about fiscal conservatism, although it is a waste. It's a fundamental issue of racial justice. And we cannot have racial justice without addressing the racism that is built in, steeped in, instantiated in the DNA of our criminal justice system. I am happy to go on a journey with people who see it strictly from a fiscal conservative perspective of wasting government money, or the efficacy, to your point, of how to actually expend public dollars to address issues of criminality. We need to be able to do that without saying, oh, we have the higher moral ground because we're looking at it from the standpoint of race. I am fine with, however, let's get to the goal line of changing this system. I don't have to change your mind or have agreement with you on everything. If we agree on the goal, the objective, which is why I think we've been so successful in the CJ space.
Yeah.
I think that's also why, I mean, and this is where I think the rubber hits the road for some people, and I appreciate it. I think, one of the things that sort of Professor Hooks mentioned about sort of liberalism is it's fundamentally
You're the road scout. Let's be fair.
It's a long time ago. It's fundamentally optimistic outlook, and I think that is true. Sort of at the DNA level of competing accounts of liberalism is an idea that progress is possible, if not necessarily inevitable. And I think that the example you gave, Darren, I think is an example of a debate that comes up on a lot of issues around criminal justice and public safety, which is that you'll often have center-right libertarian groups and progressive organizations agreeing on the goal. And what just to be specific about it, what a lot of the center-right groups will not do is buy into a certain historical analysis of racism as cumulative and as systemic, as embedded in our institutions. And I think the reason that sectarian Christian conflict feels quaint is because actually it was being on a journey around a shared goal that began to change people's minds about their fundamental differences, about their fundamental beliefs. So again, I accept that this is not an argument for everybody, but I do tend to believe that there are more center-right groups that now do embrace a historicism about race because they've been involved in this work than would have had they not. In addition to obviously agreeing that the goal itself becomes totally loose.
And this is a really important point that we didn't make in the piece, but I think it's another reason to advocate for pluralism. So it's not just the people that may have started off thinking about the fiscal side of the criminal justice system, learned about the racial discrimination that's embedded in a lot of the criminal justice system. It's also that people who started off, Darren, from the perspective that you just described, they got open to working with, say, faith communities who were motivated by redemption. Or the constitutional argument that was made by a lot of the groups that we worked with that said this is the example of government run amok, right? The violation of individual liberties and acting way outside of the bounds of the proper role of government in people's lives. And so you learn about all of these different arguments from different perspectives. And then so today, if you asked any number of the dozens of groups that we work with, what is your motivation? The answer is not one thing, right? We've got our each of us have our sort of primary motivations, and that's fine. But there's all sorts of reasons, right, why we ought to be engaged in this kind of reform. So we learn and we evolve our position. Doesn't mean we change our minds, but we become better at what we do through this approach.
So isn't that what democracy looks like, if you took it large, right, is coming together around a shared solution, even though your initial analysis could be very different. But it does involve, Sam, compromise, right? A whole lot of it. And more you hear in the public square a sense that compromise is capitulation. You know, and you hear that in Washington a lot. You know, my constituents would never forgive me agreeing to X, Y, and Z. How is democracy, can democracy work as long as compromise is not considered an essential part of it?
Well, I mean, I think there's an important distinction in what you said. I think there's a big difference between an individual person who says, you know, the safety of my family is at stake, the safety of my children is at stake, you know, whether it's about race, whether it's about climate, and the politician who says, I can't compromise because I won't get re-elected. And I think the latter is, to some extent, makes the former more difficult, right? I think we're living in an era where, put aside the substance, to be seen to compromise on certain fundamental issues is to be perceived as a kind of class traitor in ideological politics that has huge electoral consequences that are mostly structural, that mostly have to do with who votes in primaries. And we don't need to get into a big discussion about government reform here. I sort of going back to where I think some of the stronger critiques are, I understand people who say, don't tell me to compromise. It's not happening fast enough. It's not happening to a significant enough degree. My family's not safe. I don't feel safe. I'm not getting the same rights as someone else. I also think that, again, a discourse of compromise can be used to mollify people who otherwise have legitimate grievances. That's one of the reasons I do think that, for my part, it was really important in the piece that we make the argument that we should have big, full-throated disagreements. You know, the idea is to enlarge the space of disagreement. And as Darren, as you pointed out, the worst thing that can happen is you actually start to chill the substantive and important disagreement that you need to have to get to these solutions. So, you know, I don't have a good answer to your question. I don't think the performativity of politics is helping. I don't think the nationalization of politics is helping. I think the criminal justice example to me is also an example of people in community and proximity working together and figuring out how do we do something together. People is seeing each other face to face and saying, can we hold our nose even though we disagree about, and we're losing a lot of that in the way that our politics is enacted. I don't know where the line is. I don't know where the place is that you just make the argument for compromise for its own sake. At the very least, we're just saying, let's create the space for debate, and not just for its own sake, for its instrumental benefit in addressing these problems.
Darren, you're thinking very hard.
No, I'm reflecting on a session that I spoke at. There were significantly young African Americans, and the consensus among the group, as I discussed President Obama and his ability to build bridges and compromise, and the consensus among the group that Barack Obama was failed as a president. And part of the reason he failed was because he believed that he could compromise with people who hated him, and that he was naive in his understanding of the context in which he was leading and seeking to make policy. And I found that really disconcerting. I had not encountered that before. And it just reminds me of what you have said, which is people feel, particularly people who have historically been oppressed and marginalized, that the notion of compromise on its face disadvantages people who have already been disadvantaged. So when we say, let's compromise, which I believe is fundamental to a democracy, we will not succeed in this American experiment if we cannot compromise. But I also understand when people say, we have been compromising. We have been compromising. And look at where we are. We are about to, in just a few days, be told that it is basically unconstitutional to have a racial conscience when it comes to decisions around admissions to higher education institutions, and what that then means for the larger enterprise of racial reckoning. And so people will say, we're tired of compromising. And we have to acknowledge that and still give those people who feel exhausted and feel depleted and demoralized in this moment reasons for hope. And that is hard to do. You know, I find reasons of hope when I look. Fannie Lou Hamer lived in a time, and she believed in this country when she knew she would never see a day of justice. And yet she believed. I could go on and on. And so, yes, many people are exhausted, but we stand on the shoulders of people who had far less privilege, far less access to resources and influence. And so what option do we have but hope?
I'm going to turn to the audience on that note, because all of you are experts in this question. As citizens, some of you as philanthropists, but you bring your own expertise to the table. So if we can get some mics, there's a mic over there. Let's see some hands go up, way in the back of the room.
Hi, thank you for the conversation. It seems to be like this is an interesting working theory of change of its own. Very curious about the language of toxifiers and how you qualify that. At first I got excited, I was like, yeah, and then I said, whoa, that gets dangerous in and of itself to introduce the concept, not qualify it, then people quickly weaponize it in the world of media and technology that we have. I thought about John Powell, othering belonging, he talks about breaking, but that's me inserting that, which is again where the danger is. I'd imagine James Baldwin might have been considered a toxifier. People would believe women in leadership, toxifiers to a certain dominant opinion at a certain time in history. So I'm curious how you are all sitting with that, and is that in the next paper, or where does this go from there for those of us that are thinking from, again, that operational theory of change point for the work of what you're talking about?
Thank you.
I think it makes sense to say a word about John Powell's theory of change.
Well, I would certainly we support John Powell's work. I'm a great fan. I just want to be clear when I say toxifier. I think there are people in our society who benefit from division, who seek to divide, who come to the square not with good intent. So I'm a believer that most of us in this country seek to make this society better. But there are people who seek to do harm in this country. And there are people who benefit from division. Those are the toxifiers. And again, there are qualitative ways of looking at this, to your point, but I think we feel often that the objective of some is not to find solutions. They rarely talk about a solution. They most often talk about how somebody else is bad, as opposed to coming in with a message that we have to find our common humanity. And so for me, I have not defined the term, and maybe you're prompting me to actually write this out as a definition, because that would probably help. But I think because we see it every day and we feel it so much, it is so manifest. So I take your admonition and question, and will reflect on how I might actually articulate this in writing and share it more broadly, because I've used the term and I've written about the public square and talked about, I don't think James Baldwin, I think there are people who might have saw James Baldwin as a toxifier, but James Baldwin talked about believing in America. He was angry at America. He was pissed off at America. But he left America because he was so frustrated. But he helped this country think about things, and he contributed to a dialogue. And yes, there were elites and incumbents in power, but there were a lot of people like him over time who I think there is a broad agreement that there are certain people who are just out there dividing us. And I don't think there are people who, even in history, even when you go back to, I understand there were people who thought Martin Luther King was a toxifier. But I don't think most people thought that. But so thank you for that. And we'll talk after.
So one of the things that we've seen with the Ford Foundation is a real commitment to supporting emerging leaders, particularly people of color. Who are leading nonprofits, who are out in the marketplace of ideas is exactly where John Powell is, right?
Absolutely. And has been for years. John's not young. I mean, he's wonderful, but
so that's going to be the
out
quotable.
there influencing us for a long time, certainly since I've been in philanthropy.
I'm gonna let that one pass. Anyway, and you've got Angela, you've got PolicyLink, you've got some really remarkable organizations that are taking a clear leadership role in the world of ideas, but also the world of action, and are very good at talking across ideological divides. There's a recognition of the need for all of us to do that. I saw a hand on this. I just wanted to be as open-minded to those on my right as those on my left in the audience. So here we've got a microphone.
Hello.
Identify yourself if you would.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Elizabeth. I'm from Germany, and I would say my English is 5 years old, so I hope I can get my question across. But so I was wondering how like the idea of universalism plays a role in the idea of philanthropy. Philanthropy. You can say it. Philanthropy. Yeah. What is does universalism play a role in it, or is it like the opposite of it?
Right. Does universalism play a role, Sam? I'm going to give it to you first.
Sure. I'll take a crack. Thank you for your question. I think it depends on what you think philanthropy is for. I think if, in my view, is that while the structure of philanthropy may be accidental, like any kind of institution is accidental, it's the accumulation of a lot of different decisions that are made in different points in time. We tolerate its existence because we think it contributes to something essential about our democracy. And one of the ideas that's essential, I think, to American liberalism is an idea that there is some fundamental kind of universalism about the ability to have our own idea of what the good life is. That's the heart of pluralism. What's challenging about pluralism is that certain conceptions about the good life come into contact with each other. If my idea of a good life is you need to believe this about God, and I think anyone who doesn't believe that is a threat, that's a challenge. If my idea of the good life is this racial caste should be above that racial caste, then those things come into conflict. And to me, the way in which an idea of universalism is at the heart of philanthropy is because it's private interests. It's individual founders saying, I care about the arts. And in a given town, you might decide that public health is more important than the arts in a particular budget. Or you might decide in a state that we've really got to focus on K through 12 education instead of the arts. But I think the arts are important. I think the arts have a role here. And my ability to determine for myself that that is something really valuable in a democracy is the thing that is embodied in ultimately what that foundation chooses to do. But then that's also a reason that it's important to have a lot of different things that are being funded out of philanthropy, that our conviction somehow has to be that the aggregation of all those diverse interests is good for us, even if not all of the interests are equal. But look, we're in a moment where an idea of universalism, that there might be something that we all have in common, is under a lot of scrutiny and under threat. And some of those threats I don't think very highly of, and some of those threats are asking really difficult and probing questions. One of the best questions is one that we keep coming back to around race, which is that too often the word universalism has meant what works for a certain white caste. And we're going to call that universal, and we're going to call that impartial, but it's in no way universal, and it's in no way impartial. It's a set of structures and decisions and incentives and opportunities that are obviously inuring more to the benefit of one group of people on the basis of their skin color and how that's perceived than to the benefit of another. So even if we have a fundamental belief in something like universalism, we have to keep probing it. We have to keep probing what we mean by that and how it's manifesting, and whether that is really living up to the kind of ideal that is supposed to be contained in that idea.
So I'm really glad that a friend from Germany is raising this question at the end, because it gives me an opportunity to say something about the difference between German democracy and American democracy as it relates to philanthropy. You know that Tocqueville always sort of wrote beautifully about citizens associating and finding their own solutions. But after the Second World War, European governments formed institutes, right, to contribute to the marketplace of ideas. They were government financed, government created. At the same time in the US, we decided instead to seed through philanthropy think tanks like the Aspen Institute, for example, but also academic programs. So there's this structural difference, which is part of the reason, only part of the reason these leaders see philanthropy as fundamental to democracy, at least our version of democracy, not the only version, but ours. So Brian, first time I met you, you came to the Aspen Institute to talk about what we could do together.
That's right.
And how we could bridge divides together. So that was my first introduction to you, and that will always be my first impression of you. Darren is simply the most charming man I know, so I try to be in the same room with him, wouldn't you? And Sam, our roadie, is about the brightest person I know, so
wow.
I feel
this
privileged.
Great panel, thank you.
So please join me in celebrating these leaders.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jane.
Jane, really appreciate it.